Howdy, Joe here. And this site on my YouTube is Joe Van. So maybe I'll talk a bit about Vancouver. And it's my hometown. Grew up and lived here most of my life. Been around some, but I wanted to kind of get started near where Vancouver starts, Hastings, Maine, which is actually the center of the skids, Skid Row. And I know that rather well too. This is maybe a bit of a mongrel's tale. I've been in recovery for half my life, and me and many people I know of are well acquainted with booze and drugs in several ways. And I've had family members die of various causes, including alcoholism. But as I say, I've been sober half my life, and I got it too. Um, and it's just one of those facts of life people live with all the time. So here's the Carnegie and the Ford building and the corner of Hastings and Main. And I'm gonna take myself out of the shot. I'm not that interesting. And talk about what's on view, and you can turn on the captions if you like. So the Carnegie Library was built in the 1900s, and it was a part of the Andrew Carnegie Endowment for Libraries, not just across the American states, but here as well, and other places, apparently. And that's a topic worth looking into. And up until 1967, the Carnegie was actually the Vancouver Museum. When I was a kid, I went to it as a museum, and that's where there was a mummy on display, a sarcophagus, and there was a taxidermy section with bear and cougar and other animals stuffed and mounted. Um, and there's a huge stained glass window and a spiral staircase, and it's actually quite a beautiful building inside. But amazingly, after the new museum was built in 67, the Carnegie sat derelict for over a decade, empty and boarded up. And actually, the building across the street, now called the Ford, was a derelict structure for many years as well, half empty or for a while boarded up and vacant or subject to squats. And in 84, the empty office building was converted into, um, I think 64, 70 or 80 apartments, small ones, mostly studios. Um, and I lived there for a while in my early recovery on the fifth floor in the west wing in the middle. So up the red lamp post to the left and down one. And yeah, that was my window. And actually, from inside, the dome was really quite beautifully centered in my window. It was a nice bit of architectural detail, a curve of embrace. And it's a beautiful building too. It was a part of my early recovery. I came there desperate for housing. Ah, excuse me, there's a siren in the background. I'm on Main Street still, only a few blocks south. So I lived there in early recovery. I had a roommate who was going out using, and I needed a better place to be, and I found it there and lived there for 3.5 years at the Ford building, getting to know the manager, Wendy, as well, a really sweet woman, very helpful. Um, Anyways, my connection to the neighborhood um goes back even more. Uh, the other side of the Carnegie to the left, across the alley, is the old Roosevelt Hotel, and the one next to the Ford building, across the porch of the Carnegie there, that was the Washington. So the Roosevelt and the Washington were face to face, and down the hill west is the Balmoral, and a bit east is the Empress. So Balmoral and Empress and Roosevelt and Washington. There's an intersection of both Canadian and British interests here. And Hastings, um, the Battle of Hastings, where the Norman conquest. Well, uh, it was actually a battle between two factions in a five faction family. Things could have turned out otherwise, but some of the other branches were Norse as well, more Norse than the Normans. Um, and French and English are intertwined in Canada as much as back then. Kind of funny. So many traces of details. Uh, but why I mentioned the Roosevelt across the alley from the Carnegie is that was where I found my stepdad when I was contemplating sobering up, um, and finding out and admitting that yes, I was a drunk too. A part of that, a part of getting serious was giving him a visit, and that meant finding him. I hadn't seen him in years. And I kind of scouted around the neighborhood and just asked people if they knew where George was. That's my stepdad. And found him at the Roosevelt over the alley. He had a window over the alley. The thing is that that alley has some terracotta tiled alcoves. It's quite a startling architectural detail. And actually, it's a historical um, detail of Vancouver is that that was kind of that alleyway behind the Carnegie was a fruit market, or other incidental stuff that people could pick up. And it was also a way for people to do some merchandising. Um, Anyways, one of the details of me living in the Ford building was I could see the window of my stepdad's room. And I'd visited him when I'd sobered up, and he was really happy to see me. And he cracked a bottle of whiskey to salute the occasion, but I didn't join him for a drink. But I did chat with him for more than an hour, uh, and talked about a bunch of things and had a congenial parting, wished him well, and let him know that actually a part of it was an amends visit. Let him know that, gee, um, being raised by an alcoholic can be a bitch, and I had some resentments, and I'd actually hated him at several points in coming up, and I wanted to let him know that now that I realized I was a lush too, not to say all's forgiven, but I'm a lush too, and some of that I got too. And that can be a tough thing to admit, particularly when it's, you know, stuff that you want no part of. Um, so sobering up takes some deciding and takes some consistent attention over time. Just on one side, delete an error or two, you know, give conscious attention to self-improvement by removing an error and asserting a value, whether it be honesty or grace or beauty or usefulness. Anyway, the spiritual life is not a theory. It takes some thought and work. Um, I could chat around about Vancouver, and I probably will, but this is just a preliminary glimpse of, oh, so my stepdad died of alcoholism. Um, uh, actually, he was getting on. I was lucky to have caught him still alive when I said, hey, mentioned to some siblings they could maybe give him a gander, say hey, because he wasn't well. But I don't know there were any were so inclined, and the one I asked was not. Um, but my biological father died on the skids when I was 2 of alcoholism, and just up the street, maybe a bit. My mom was, we were up at Little Mountain by then, maybe Little Mountain Affordable Housing. Um, when mom heard that dad died through friends and friends of friends. And that was all when I was 2, and I don't know very much more about it. A picture of him. He was much older than mom. Um, so I've had 2 dads die of alcoholism and 1 brother. Uh, and they're long, complicated stories. I'll maybe get into some details some other time. Oh, noticing the detail of the traffic is cut off. I got this angle from the camera from the street, and traffic is turned off because this is the day of the Chinatown parade. So, uh, February-ish, Chinese New Year. Nice excuse to get out and breathe the air, even if it is gray and maybe wet. Okay, enough of that for now. On to the next picture. I was out on the seawall recently and took this shot, and it's got a few aspects that uh kind of grabbed my attention. Um, Science World, the glitter dome is there in the middle, the silver moon kind of thing, and it's nicely centered. But way over stage left or left elbow, there's a golden globe. This there's this ornamental street light that's on in the daytime, and a golden globe and a silver globe together on the seawall. And that strikes a note for me that's quite gorgeous. And mentioning music is the the banister along the seawall is almost like a staff uh, laid out for musical notes curving along the seawall as if there's a quiet music. And then there's the branch over top and it's almost like an embrace of shade uh, when it's maybe too bright, or just an embrace from nature by a branch in the sky. Um, it What makes it more Vancouvery to me is that it reminds me of a poem by Pauline Johnson called Lost Lagoon. Um, but I kind of have it in mind as a corollary, a balance, uh, another dash of art, as in Found Lagoon. Um, Lost Lagoon is wrapped in a forest, and Found Lagoon is wrapped in a city, and Lost Lagoon may best be seen from a paddle, whereas Found Lagoon may best be seen from a bicycle, uh, perhaps. Anyways, I was gonna just share a little bit of that poem from Pauline Johnson. Oh, lure of the lost lagoon, I dream tonight that my paddle blurs the purple shade where the seaweed stirs. I hear the call of the singing firs in the hush of the golden moon. And I think she died in 1912. Um, but the name she suggested for that oyster bank, a salt, a salty sandbar, um, with oysters and barnacles and starfish. It was a vestigial place because it, when the tide went out, it was a whole bunch of sand and rocks and oysters and maybe a few tidal pools. But when the tide came in, he could paddle right up to under the trees in hushed hollows for a romantic, private conversation. And those are all worth noticing and appreciating. Anyways, so a part of why I want to mention this is that this is also my neighborhood now, um, where the seawall curves a bit to the left. Those towers behind, I'm kind of the other side of there. And the hospital's going in the other side of there. And that's my neighborhood. But what I want to bring to your attention in particular, excuse me, is a bit to the right, over top of the water taxi with the red roof, there's a hollow of um, building sites that are being contemplated for development. And because the neighborhood I'm in is called Citygate, um, maybe I'll call it Citygate South, um, as in where the density is growing. And I'm actually a beneficiary of density because I used to live in the Ford building, but when they were building Citygate, they wanted they had to include some affordable rentals for locals who lived here. And I got one of those. I'm very, very, very lucky. And I really, really appreciate it. And I want to be an emphatic advocate for inclusion in development discussions. And so there's a lot to be discussed. And I'm going to be chatting a bit about buildings, um, and mentioning two particular developments that are going in right in that pocket in between the Glitter Dome and just uh, up right from the red water ferry, that gray green building. Anyway, that pocket of empty is has some proposals, and I'll be looking at two of them. There are many, many others, but this is just to include a couple. And again, the seawall. It, if Joe Van is an advocate of Vancouver, which I am, hey again, and I think one of the best ways of seeing Vancouver is just wandering the seawall, maybe with a bike because it can be long, or a wheelchair like I do, or um, there's lots of ways of getting about. You can suit yourself, but it's a beautiful city, and it's nice to be able to see it from multiple points of view. Um, so I'm not going to jar you off a whole bunch, but I am going to talk about some things of significance. Okay. And so next is about some development. Well, this is the McDonald's site on Main Street behind Science World. And the development proposal is for 22 stories and 18 stories and about 400 apartments, and the McDonald's will be replaced on the Main Street frontage, and there'll be other shopping on the Quebec Street frontage, and um in kind of a laneway in between Maine and Quebec for the cycle route. But no drive-through for the McDonald's. Anyways, the parcel's um owned by a corporation, American, called Graystar, called that has a specialty for student housing around the world. And Vancouver actually has quite a strong background in international student education. And the student housing market is an important one of many requiring support. So this is going to be 400 units plus plus a few things. Um, and it's it's actually right next door. This side of the parcel, I'm going to show you the one right next door in a moment. Um, belongs to the city of Vancouver, and it's just a bit bigger than the McDonald's site, almost an acre and a half of a parking lot. Um, and that's going to be going up next door, but also much higher. Um, give me a sec. And here's the site next door, which shows the Vancouver City-owned parcel parking lot at Terminal in Quebec through to Terminal in Maine. And that has a 42-story tower in the foreground and a 22-story tower in the background. And it totals almost 900, over 900 units, almost 1,000 units. And it's quite immense. But to the left, Vancouverites would recognize Vancity's headquarters with the SkyTrain going in underneath to Main Street Station. most Vancouverites know this corner very well because they go through it, you know, um, by the millions. And they know that that view of the Glitter Dome directly to the west over the right shoulder and the ocean inlet of False Creek and the seawall is right there. All beautiful assets, just a step away. And that proximity is useful and valuable. But a couple of things to draw to your attention is that the city, by going 42 stories, actually using the Broadway density policy, which is valid and which I concur and agree with. The SkyTrain is for focusing density, and that's a very valuable function. And it means that a lot of people don't have to own cars and garages and everything else, that they can get around in multiple other ways. And those are to be cultivated, fostered, and explored. And geez, like the central uh, pathway, including a bike route, is a SkyTrain adjacent other valuable. The SkyTrain is actually also propagating bike routes. So using transit can make space for other wheelies. And I'm a wheelie in a wheelchair, so I'm an advocate. But a couple of points here is that including the McDonald's site with the city's parking lot site, that means 4 buildings in tight proximity, but they were planned separately and have emphatic variations because the city-owned site used the Broadway density policy implementations, whereas the Gray Star property for international student housing was limited by the view corridors from Little Mountain and is so only 18 stories and 22 stories itself. I'm not exactly sure on those numbers, but it's the city-owned parcel is almost 1,000 units, and the Gray Star property is about almost 400 units. So it's an emphatic bias um, opportunity shift here. And I think that Gray Star should come back and say, uh, we'd like to exercise the SkyTrain proximity density policy as well and go high. But I I like density and I like views. But I think that if they're gonna block the views from otherwheres, they gotta make their new views available. In other words, uh, a restaurant or a public amenity up at the top that citizens can use to take in the view. This is a very beautiful city we share, and we're aware, educated, and can see and think and talk and meet each other. and agree and disagree and lots of other things too. Um, a lot of people have come out of difficulties and out of conflict or are in recovery of one flavor or another and reestablishing themselves. And a frequent step along that road is student housing of some sort. And um, the Ford building was a big help to me. And I actually did go to school from there. Funny to think. Um, the thing is that in in healing and in reestablishing oneself and starting small, sometimes a small space is kind of fitting. I'm recalling that student housing um that I could rely on for years to learn and establish myself allowed me to turn my life around. And that's something that should be included in long-term planning. And one of the things I picked up is that there was another development around student housing that it was going to be redeveloped and going condo. So they implemented a policy of retaining the student housing that was there before in one level of a mezzanine for students. And it was what, 12 or 18 units, something like that. Small, snug student quarters um, on a mezzanine, but it was a perch in the world from which they could survive and learn how to thrive. And I'd like to suggest that, like, as a policy, not just for these four buildings, but as an idea to be kept in mind for other places as well. Um, so a restaurant at the top, you know what I call that one? The crow's nest, because the crows sometimes come in at dusk and they can be very beautiful, exciting, and a Vancouver moment. And they may go out in the morning, that would imply. I've not been up for their dispersals, but I have seen their accumulations many times. And have a place like that where you could go out and watch the birds and the sunset. And in mentioning all the view corridors around Vancouver, uh, the one that's actually had some long-term attention is Georgia Street. And the east end of Georgia Street frames Science World, the Glitter Dome, right there. And the west end of Georgia Street centers on the Lost Lagoon Fountain, right there. And this building will be right behind Science World on that alignment. And to be perched at the top, watching the crows come in at dusk and the sunset glow, and quite beautiful. Worth sharing. Also, I noticed the texture in this building architecturally, and it reminds me that nature needs to be a part of our lives more, although finding ways where it doesn't breach and propagate and infect and overflow, those are issues, of course, in play. But I'm thinking of a lattice of vines, maybe like the Sylvia Hotel. Uh, but also the balconies might welcome hummingbirds. Uh, hummingbirds are cliff friendly and they migrate from Alaska to Mexico, and they're not afraid of mountains. And so student housing, a whole bunch. If those four buildings were planned together with a kind of thoughtful, um, multi-leveled integration, it could make room not just for the McDonald's drive-through, but a porte cochere of social usefulness and also maybe a level where people are welcome to congregate in a place where there's some actual light. Vancouver gets very gray and washed out of light. And actually, a place like that might give people a reminder that, hey, have you taken your vitamin D lately? You're not depressed, you're nutritionally deprived. And dummy up, eh? Take care of yourself. Uh, Anyways, I could ramble on several other notes. Um, but talking about developments, maybe include space for recovery, uh, a space to have a meeting. Hmm? Anyways, uh, I probably rambled on more than 20 minutes and sorry about that. So I'll call it a wrap for now and we'll talk more some other time. If you've got some comments or thoughts, you know how to put down your comments and thoughts. And feel free to speak your mind. Ain't that what communication is? Thank you kindly for your attention. Hope you're well. Take care. Bye.